Welcome to the Art of Semi-Fiction. I am Robin Miller.
And I'm Jane Daly.
And today we're going to be talking about memoir. I know we've already kind of mentioned it pretty much in all the episodes so far. What is kind of the big deal about memoir?
Yeah, that's my big question is, what's with this resurgence of memoir writing?
Well, I think we've touched on it a couple times. And the funny thing is memoir has been always thought of as we've already talked about as being for famous people. Mm-hmm. And if you weren't, didn't do something like cure cancer, something huge, or you were just not a famous person, you were not going to get a memoir sold. Nobody's going to be interested. Yeah. But the shift that we've been talking about to a personal narrative that people can connect with is part of it. It's part of the way that our society is just wanting that conversation to be had.
And this goes beyond a how-to.
Yes. Because a memoir, even though like we talked about before, a memoir is about a section of your life or a specific event or a short period of time in which you learned something, in which you grew in some way. Mm-hmm. So the kind of setting, as we also talked about, the difference between plot and story, plot being what happens, and story being the emotional journey. So memoir now is recognized and accepted, a really, really good, well-written memoir. The plot doesn't really matter, and it used to matter. It used to matter who was in it, who the characters were, whether they were famous or not, whether they did something, the first person to climb Mount Everest or, that kind of thing. But now the focus has shifted from that plot to the story, and the story is the emotional journey.
A universal truth.
Yeah, and that's really why it's now accessible. Really well written memoir is one of the fastest growing genres and one of the most widely read. So as we talked about in the last episode when you were discussing the fictional techniques used in nonfiction, that's how we want our writing now. We want it relational. We want to feel like we're getting to know the author, that we're entering into their life, and you do that through fictional techniques in nonfiction, which add those together, and that's personal narrative or memoir.
Well, and it's some of those well-written nonfiction memoir type books stay with you.
Yeah.
Because there's a truth there that you can relate to.
Yeah.
One of the books that I read several years ago when I was kind of going through a difficult time with caregiving for my mom was called Mother, Daughter, Me. And it was basically telling the story of her very troubled relationship with her mother and how her mother ended up coming to live with her and how that looked. Really helpful.
Yeah.
But it wasn't this is how I learned to love my mother type of book.
Exactly. Because I don't know how you sell those anymore. I mean, we both teach at writing conferences. We both attend writing conferences and workshops and things. So we're around writers and editors and publishers and agents all the time. And I have not heard any of them say, I want a dry, just a how-to book that just gives you the bare facts and there's no entry of the
heart.
There's no relationship. Yeah. That is not what the industry is doing right now. One of the things I wanted to do is to just reread that. I love the difference between. Check out the things that are on that website. It's kind of a cool website. Differencebetween.net. And I'm reading the definition that I read earlier. An autobiography is a biography that someone has written about their own life in a similar manner as a biography. So a biography is somebody writing about your life. Autobiography, you writing about your life. This may be published while they're still alive or posthumously. And I'm not going to say the other end of that because it was redundant. A memoir focuses on certain memories, experiences, or particular aspects of someone's life. So the difference being one chronological and memoir being about an event, set of events, a circumstance, that there's some from the beginning, that inciting incident you were talking about, to the end, some emotional journey has occurred. The interesting thing about people calling it a memoir, back in the day, way back in the day, all the terms around writing meant different things.
Right.
So if you said you were self-published back in the day, that means you're not a real writer because you can't get anybody to publish your work, right? And now we have a lot of things that have been, the Shack was self-published, and there's a lot of author friends that we know that are making $1 bazillion self-publishing because it's completely legitimate. Back in the day, saying that you're a memoirist, people would think, well, who the heck do you think you are?
You're not famous.
Yeah.
What have you done?
Yeah.
Have you walked on the moon?
Well, that's kind of like saying I'm a fashion guru. It's kind of like, it was that kind of weird thing. Now, that's not it anymore. You had to hide if you were a memoirist a while ago. And now it's more of just an accepted way of telling a story.
And it's interesting because a lot of people still don't use the M word. They will say, I am writing narrative nonfiction.
Yeah.
Which is really what I think I've written. It's not, I wouldn't consider it a memoir because it's not my entire life. It is narrative nonfiction.
But a memoir is an entire life.
Around a certain event.
So that is memoir. But it's interchangeable.
Right.
It's not that, some people call it a personal narrative. Some people say narrative nonfiction. Memoir, it's kind of all the same thing. You're just tweaking it a little bit in a general direction. You've got a little bit more application in yours. Whereas straight memoir it's really almost reads like a story. Really, it reads almost like fiction.
And it should.
And and there isn't at the end, and let me, summarize with 3 points that I learned from this journey. It's not that kind of thing.
Right.
Like a couple years ago when I was in college, one of my degrees was in English literature, and I focused on Jewish American literature, and loved it. I don't know why. I'm not Jewish. I don't know why. I just loved it. But one of my my favorite author from that period is Chaim Potok, and he wrote fiction. But one of the other people that this is like 30 years later, and it still emotionally affects me, is Elie Wiesel's Night. I didn't know that was true. I didn't know it was a true story. It was a winner of the 1986 Nobel Peace Prize, and it's a story about the concentration camps. It's about an experience in the concentration camps, but the course is Jewish American literature. And I don't know if I was just stupid back then or something, but literature to me wasn't nonfiction. Right? Literature is fiction.
Right.
So now I wish that I could go back. And I worked a lot when I was in college to pay for an expensive college. So I recognized that I was, half asleep during some of my classes. So it might have been that it was talked about and I wasn't awake enough. But I don't remember it ever being presented as nonfiction. But if it's true, so I wonder if that was a little bit of hiding the fact that it was nonfiction.
Because it was less acceptable back then.
And, or maybe for import, maybe for impact of, or maybe to hide his own experience or the experience of people that he's talking about. There's all sorts of reasons for you to choose to present something. I think it goes only one way. If it's nonfiction, I don't think that you can say it's, and you use fiction in it, lie, untruth.
then it's
fiction. Then I don't think you can say it's straight nonfiction. If it's true, but you couch it as fiction, I think I'm a little bit more lenient. What do you think? I feel like people have a right to tell their stories in the way that they feel safe and comfortable telling their stories.
Absolutely.
I know there's one of our mutual friends, Jenny Weitrip, wrote a fiction piece of fiction, her book Words, but there's a lot of truth in that too. And I think that was the way she chose to tell the story, and I totally respect that. I have no problem with that at all.
Because you think about it, if she writes it as fiction, then back up. If she wrote it as a nonfiction, this is what happened to me, then I don't know, do you think then she would carry that label of, oh, there's that woman who had that horrible thing happen to her?
Possibly.
And that's the only thing that she's capable of writing about or something. I think that her writing it as fiction really made it come alive.
Yeah.
And of course, those details that she shared in the book, how could she not have experienced that? And been able to translate that into the details that were in her book.
But when you experience a trauma of any kind, whether it is something like that or, I had childhood abuse too. That's what my memoir is about. Although it's really not about the abuse as we've talked about. It's about how hope happened despite the abuse. So it's really about hope. At least I hope that's what it's about. But I chose to write it in that way. I chose not to give certain details and certain descriptions and certain information, partially because I didn't think it was necessary to what I wanted to write about, which wasn't the abuse, it was hope. Mm-hmm. And so that was the way that I told the story that I wanted to tell. And when you were writing about, 2 difficult seasons in your life, both of your books have to do with very difficult seasons that tons of people can relate to. And the format that you chose, the way that you chose to write about it, you could have written about it in a million different ways. But what you chose was right for the story you wanted to tell. Mm-hmm. So I have no problem with somebody calling something fiction when there's a lot of truth or mostly truth in it. I have a problem the other way, though. I think that if you're saying this is truth and there's things that are not.
Right, so what you're saying is when you're writing memoir, what you're writing must be true.
Yeah.
And you don't have to include every detail, because really truly what we're looking at today in writing memoir is offering people hope.
Yeah.
It's not just, let me tell you about this horrible thing that happened. And I'm thinking of that, what was that movie, The Three Faces of Eve or something like that, where it was just, or Mommy Dearest, where you're reading it going, wow, this is just horrible and this person had a horrible life. Instead, we as Christians are writing about, this was bad, but look where it took me.
Yeah.
And that's the hope.
And look who's walking with me.
And that's the difference in today's memoir telling and back, 10 years ago.
Well, the point of it's like the old point of memoir was to just almost give like a voyeuristic look into a famous person's life, almost, kind of a thing. Whereas now there's that universal truth that we're talking about, that it's just the plot is an experience that you had, or a situation or a circumstance, but the story is universal. Well, I use this as an example when we talk about, you can take one event in your life. So we've already mentioned that we both have lost sons. And I can look at the loss of my son and I can tell a story about that, how my son Seth was, how it made me think that I couldn't let his legacy be just grief. I had to honor him, not just grieve him. So that all he brought to my life, because I lost him as an infant, was grief. Mm-hmm. That I couldn't do. So I could tell a story about how I came to that moment where I said, that cannot be my son's legacy, and how that changed me. Or I could talk about how I was in another country. I was living in England. My husband's British. We were living in England. And I feel like I failed him because it's a different medical system. I knew something was wrong. I kept telling them, I kept going into the doctors, I kept getting ultrasounds, I kept saying there's problems, and they kept patting me on my head and saying, this is your first pregnancy.
Stiff upper lip.
Yeah, basically, have a nice cup of tea. And even though the truth is, I did everything. The truth is, and I know that with my head, but my mama's heart is, what else could I have done? So that left me feeling like I failed a child. So I could tell a story of feeling like failure. Or you could tell the story of, you could come at it from different angles, can't you?
Sure.
So that's how when you're doing that narrative nonfiction, personal narrative, memoir take on a story, you're choosing an element of that story to tell.
Right.
Every story there's no one story that has just one thing that you learn from it or one angle that you can come at, right? So from your son's death, you could have come from the same, could I have done something different? Was it my fault? All the mother things that we all think, right? Or you could have talked about, you know, the hope that we have, you know, in spending eternity with
Right.
Bobby. And, you know, you could have come at it from all sorts of different angles, but it's one story, right? And I think that that's important for us to recognize when we're talking about memoir, personal narrative or narrative nonfiction, is that focusing on that universal, whatever that thing is that other people can connect to, that takes it out of our plot. So maybe you haven't lost, you didn't lose it. Did you lose a child as an infant? I don't think you did. But that wasn't your experience. So I can look at your loss and say, I don't know what it would be like to lose an adult child. But I can imagine things about it because it's a different experience than losing a baby who hasn't decided whether or not they like Brussels sprouts and, you know, hasn't been really good at art or whatever it is. It's a different kind of loss. It's more of a loss of, I mean, yes, we're grieving that baby, but we're also losing the hopes and the dreams. Now, other people may have not lost a child at either stage, but they may have lost, you know, through health issues. They may have lost mobility, or they may have lost, you know, their dream of being a football player may have ended, you know, on one bad play and one, you know, knee injury.
Yeah, or they could have a devastating fire and have scars.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
give up their dream of being a TV caster.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
do you think then that as Christian writers, we need to decide, is this going to be something that I'm going to be comfortable sharing in a memoir type setting, or would I be more comfortable sharing it as a fiction? Because I know that, you know, I'm writing right now about something very difficult that I went through when I was a young adult, and I'm fictionalizing it because I'm not comfortable right now sharing that. So do you think that that's pretty universal?
I think the whole kind of professional industry shift is towards serving the story, and you find the way that serves the story best. When you chose this way, and it's kind of interesting because Jane and I are friends as well as writing partners and teachers in tandem and other things. So we have a lot of connection. And I watched you write, and she'll sit down and she'll write 4 billion words in a minute, and she'll say, oh yeah, it's 6:30 a.m. now. I think I'll, you know, go on my spin cycle class or whatever. And I'm just in awe of how prolific a writer you can be when you have a certain kind of thing in mind and you know what you're doing. I've never seen you struggle with writing. Not
now.
Yeah, but it's not struggling with the mechanics of writing, how to write. It's the emotion. You're digging deeper than I've ever seen you dig into a story that is super important to you. And that is probably why this is the absolute best way for you to tell the story, because I can't imagine if you took off all the fiction and all the trappings of the way that we couch it, because again, she's not writing the exact story of her life, she's writing the emotional truths of the story. So she's the circumstances are all different and the people are different, but some of the pain and some of the questions and some of the just tension in characters are things that you have through another set of circumstances experienced as well. So don't think that this is like it's autobiographical, then you're going to learn a lot about Jane by reading this. But the truth is, if you're writing good fiction, you are tapping into truth somehow. And that truth here is an emotion and a set of questions and a journey that you took. So it's hard. It's deep stuff, right? It's where the real stuff lies.
Well, and I'm sure that you have experienced that in writing the memoir that you just wrote. That, you know, how do I take those things that happened that were so devastating, and yet at the end of the story say, but God.
Yeah. Well, and through it, to be able to look back, it was an interesting experience because through a weird set of circumstances, I ended up writing it very quickly. As a thesis project, my first thesis was okay and didn't need any real changes. My professor said, why don't you give a go at doing a memoir? I said, we got 10 seconds before I have to turn in the draft. She's all, meh. And I thought, I'm never, an MFA terminal degree. There isn't anything past it. It's kind of like the PhD. So I wasn't ever going to have an opportunity to learn. So I thought, okay. And in 17 days, I effectively wrote
And you call me prolific.
But I've never done that before.
Wow.
But I've never done that before. And it was about 2/3 done at that point. 3/4, somewhere in there. But I knew the story I wanted to tell. And when I knew exactly what I wanted to tell, then I didn't have to puzzle and kind of struggle with how to do, I don't know, I didn't have to think, do I include this part of the story? Do I include this character? Do I include, because I knew very linearly what story I wanted to tell, and the details popped out and into that story very, very, very quickly. Like, surprisingly so.
I think that perhaps a future podcast we should talk about whether we should be seat of the pants or whether we should be outliners.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about more because we need to wrap it up today. But one of the things that I want to touch on too is we've been talking about some hard subjects. But the reality is memoir can be funnier than crud.
Oh yeah.
Right? It can be just hysterical, or it can be heartwarming. You know, it can be just wonderfully uplifting. There's all sorts of different kinds of memoir, and I think
That's
we're
right.
gonna.
And we've been really focusing on devastating.
I know.
events,
I mean, it makes it sound like,
where,
you know.
where I'm writing about funny things that happen as you age.
Yeah.
In my other nonfiction side.
Yeah, I mean, it's so we're going to lighten the mood
Ooh,
a little.
let's lighten the mood
A little bit and talk about that, because I think that that's really important to kind of do justice to the genre. There's some really amazingly hysterical, wonderfully warm, funny memoir that have fictional techniques just all through it. So I want to, we're going to leave it there. And like I said, we'll go on another podcast because I think it's a fascinating topic. And I think that we just need to leave that little nugget of thought that it's a universal truth, whether it's, you call it memoir, narrative nonfiction, or creative nonfiction, or personal narrative, or whatever you're calling it.
Even in fiction, there's a universal truth.
There is. And so that's the techniques we're using for fiction and nonfiction, and fiction into nonfiction, and nonfiction into fiction, crossover, enrich both of those genres. And even if we don't want to admit it, there's memoir in fiction too, like we're talking about.
Absolutely.
So we're going to leave it there for today. Thank you for listening. This has been the Art of Semi-Fiction. I am Robin Miller.
I'm Jane Daly.
And thank you for listening. Please subscribe and share. We would love to see you again.
Thank you.